to his alma mater to lead this school after a successful career in law and higher education. Before returning to Grove City, President Lingo was the dean at Regent University Law School, where he led the school through a season of significant growth. A scholar and advocate for constitutional law and religious liberty, President Lingo co-founded Regent's Center for Constitutional Law and has worked to advance religious freedom through scholarship and public advocacy. His writing has appeared in leading academic journals, popular press outlets, and Christian publications. Prior to his academic career, President Lingo was a partner at an international law firm representing major institutions in complex cases while also devoting significant time to pro bono and religious liberty work. That work continues to shape his public witness and calling. A native of Northeast Ohio, President Lingo graduated first in his class at Grove City College, which I will say is probably the most significant achievement on this list, maybe the most difficult one, where he was active in campus, you won't see me doing that, active in campus leadership and ministry. He later earned his law school degree with honors from Harvard Law School, and Brad and his wife, Yvonne, have been married for 24 years and are the parents of 3 daughters. Please join me in welcoming the president of Grove City College, President Lingo.
Thanks for that introduction, John. Thank you. It's great to be with you. One of the great figures in the history of this college, J. Howard Pugh, hoped that Grove City College would encourage and inculcate into the minds and hearts of students an abiding faith in God and country, a love for freedom, a respect for truth, an acceptance of personal responsibility, and a desire to contribute to the betterment of the human race. That statement is not merely a description of Grove City College. It is in many ways a description of the American experiment itself. They are Grove City's values because they are American values. Faith in God and country, a love for freedom, a respect for truth, personal responsibility, service to others and the common good. Those are fundamental to the moral architecture that has sustained this nation for 2.5 centuries. They are the convictions that animated the founding. They are the virtues that have made it possible for this nation to flourish for 250 years, and they are the very values that Grove City has sought to preserve and pass on for the last 150 years. And that is why, as we approach this remarkable convergence, 150 years of Grove City College and 250 years of independence, I've titled my talk for today, The Most American College in America. I want to unpack that in 3 steps. First, by reflecting on our nation's semi-quincentennial and what it asks of us. Second, by remembering Grove City College's own Declaration of Independence in Grove City College versus Bell. And third, by exploring what lessons that story has for today. And of course, I want to suggest that Grove City College is the most American college in America, a phrase that was inspired, that I borrowed from a alleged but maybe apocryphal quip of Teddy Roosevelt. I suggest this because Grove City College has from its earliest days been committed to the principles that made this country free and flourishing. This is the Institute for Faith and Freedom. This college has long had a joint and indivisible commitment to faith and freedom, as the name of this institute suggests. Some people don't immediately recognize the connection between faith and freedom. Here's the answer. It's as old as the founding. Freedom requires virtue. Liberty depends on moral formation. And institutions matter, especially educational institutions, especially our small platoon, as Burke would have said, here in Western Pennsylvania. John Adams wrote in his 1798 letter to the Massachusetts militia, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." He wasn't the only founder to believe this. James Madison likewise warned in Federalist 55 that self-government, liberty, requires, quote, sufficient virtue among men, because without it, quote, nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring each other. What did they mean by that? They meant that human nature, as the Bible teaches, selfish, ambitious, quick to anger, human nature doesn't govern itself. And without virtuous citizens, as Adams warned in that same letter, the people would, quote, break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Indeed, according to Madison, without virtue among men, only the chains of despotism would be able to restrain a people lacking in virtue. In short, the founding documents and the founding principles alone won't keep us free. A free people must also be a formed people, moral, educated, and as the founders would have said, religious. Or we will tear through those constitutional freedoms the way a whale tears through a net. Freedom requires virtue, and liberty depends on moral formation, but faith also requires freedom. Freedom to worship and live according to one's own beliefs. Faith cannot be practiced without freedom, and it cannot be compelled by a central planner. It must arise from God's grace in the heart of each individual. Faith grows in a garden of freedom. Not freedom as a license, but freedom ordered in truth, freedom sustained by virtue, and freedom made possible by responsibility. That is the freedom in which faith flourishes. From its founding in 1876, this college has long had a commitment, joint and indivisible, to faith and freedom. And that understanding places Grove City squarely within the American tradition, one that recognizes that liberty is not self-sustaining and that education is not merely about skill, but about formation. Lincoln warned that the philosophy of the schoolhouse in one generation would be the philosophy of the government in the next. Reagan reminded us that freedom is never self-sustaining, that it must be renewed in every successive generation, renewed, defended, handed on with each successive generation. So as we look toward the 250th anniversary of American independence and Grove City College's 150th anniversary, as Lincoln and Reagan's warnings would suggest, this college has never been more needed or more vital. So the focus of this conference is our nation's semi-quincentennial. That's a fancy way of saying its 250th anniversary. Or if we break that down a little more, it's a fancy way of saying we're halfway as a nation to being 500 years old, semi-quincentennial. We're halfway to being 500 years old. Embedded in there is an important assumption, and that is that this country will endure for another 250 years from today. It expresses a hope, Reagan kind of hope, that the American Republic will endure. So yes, Reagan said that freedom is never one generation away from extinction, but he was not a cynic. He believed in renewal. That's why he spoke of America as a shining city upon a hill. That's why he spoke of morning in America, a nation capable of rediscovering its moral confidence. And that vision matters as we approach this semi-quincentennial anniversary. It calls on us to ask, can we preserve the preconditions of liberty long enough and faithfully enough to pass them on? That's why institutions like Grove City College exist and are so valuable. At this college, like the founders, we also believe that independence, whether that be personal or institutional or national, is worth defending even when that is costly. So as we celebrate our 250th anniversary of our nation's independence, it's worth remembering, and I want to talk a little bit about a smaller, quieter Declaration of Independence, Grove City College's own Declaration of Independence from federal control, made more than 40 years ago. Federal money may arrive as help, but it rarely comes as a no-strings gift. It follows Washington's version of the golden rule. Whoever controls the gold makes the rules. And we're seeing that lesson play out again in real time across higher education. Even at institutions that are very different from Grove City College, leaders are relearning this same principle. If a school depends on government funds, it should not be surprised when the government tries to shape what the school can do. The details may change from decade to decades, the faces and institutions may change, but the dynamic does not. So as I begin to tell the story of Grove City College versus Bell, the landmark case, I also want to acknowledge Rob Jones, a lawyer who witnessed these events firsthand, who second chaired the case at the U.S. Supreme Court and recently recounted them in an edition of the Grove City Journal of Law and Public Policy. If you don't subscribe and haven't checked that out, you really should. I had it on my desk and reread that article as I was preparing for the talk today. So come with me back to the 1960s and 70s. The federal government has now begun to play a far more expansive role in higher education. That expansion, like most federal government expansion, rarely comes through direct mandates. It came instead through funding, especially student financial aid. The logic of the government was straightforward. If federal money flowed to students and students used that money at a private college, then the colleges themselves should be subject to federal regulation, an expression of the golden rule of Washington. In other words, Washington found a way to conscript the college without passing a direct command. It could attach conditions to funds and let the funding do the persuading. The question was no longer what colleges believed, but what they could afford to resist. One such regulation was Title IX, a civil rights statute. That statute, among other things, prohibits sex discrimination in educational programs receiving federal financial assistance. Grove City College did not oppose Title IX's stated goal. And as the courts noted time and time again, there was absolutely no evidence that Grove City College had ever discriminated against anyone on the basis of sex. But we did object to the underlying principle and the mechanism by which compliance was to be enforced. The federal government required Grove City to sign an assurance of compliance form, stating that it would comply with Title IX across the entire institution and every other government regulation related to Title IX that the government might impose down the road. Signing that form would have acknowledged federal authority not merely over a specific program or in a known universe of regulations, but potentially all over every aspect of institutional life in unknown ways. And the college refused, and that set up a David versus Goliath showdown between this small college that we love and the federal government. That refusal triggered nearly a decade of litigation that culminated in the 1984 U.S. Supreme Court case of Grove City College versus Bell. Some have observed they have to go all the way back to the Dartmouth College case in 1818 to find another moment where the national policy debate focused so intensely on a single small college. Grove City took the position in that case that it did not accept federal funding and therefore didn't have to sign the certificate of assurance because it had consistently refused to accept direct federal grants and other direct institutional aid. But the college did accept payments from students who had received federal funds in the form of grants from the government. As to those dollars, the college argued that that was not federal funding to the institution. Those were funds that the government awarded to students that came to the college through students who were and should be free to use those funds wherever they chose including at Grove City College. The college drew an analogy between the student's choice about where to spend the money that they got from the government to that of a welfare recipient who uses a government check to buy groceries, and noted that no one would say that the grocery store was a recipient of federal funds in that circumstance. In short, the college argued that allowing students to use government educational grants, what later became known as Pell Grants, should not be a backdoor to subjecting the college itself to expansive and oppressive government regulation. The arguments in the case were nuanced, as it turns out, because the case spanned two different presidential administrations. And there was a change in administration partway through the case. It was started under Democrat Jimmy Carter, and then by the time it wound its way to the Supreme Court, President Ronald Reagan and his administration was in power, and the Reagan administration made an admirable attempt to prevent federal civil rights law from becoming a tool for regulating all of the operations of a private college simply because students brought federal aid dollars with them. The Reagan administration argued that accepting federal dollars subjects a college to federal regulations, but only with respect to the specific office or program that was receiving the federal funds. And in the end, the court largely adopted that limiting principle. It ruled 6-3 that Title IX would reach Grove City in a very real way, but not everywhere, that the non-discrimination obligation attached to the particular part of the college that was connected to the federal assistance, in this case it would have been our financial aid office, but not automatically to every other domain of campus life. This meant that the college's aid processes had to comply, while other areas, athletics for example, would not be swept in unless they too received covered financial funds. And it meant that enforcement could be limited and calibrated to the program at issue rather than this all or nothing threat of a cutoff across the institution. In essence, in 1984, the Supreme Court split the question in two. First, it agreed with the government that government dollars, though paid to students, were enough when the students paid them to Grove City College, were enough to treat Grove City College as a recipient of federal financial assistance, triggering Title IX coverage. But second, the court rejected the broader claim of institution or institution-wide jurisdiction, agreeing that Title IX applied only to the program or activity that received the aid, here the college's financial aid office, rather than every classroom, every decision, every campus policy. And that holding made Grove City College a flashpoint in a much larger national debate about whether civil rights conditions should attach narrowly only where federal funds are used, or broadly to the entire institution once any federal dollars touch it. And we didn't have to wait long for an answer. It turns out that the way that part of the story, which is often not fully appreciated, the way that part of the story unfolded has profound implications for the current administration's attempt to use federal funds to rein in Ivy League institutions today, under claiming that they are violating other aspects of Title IX. So the Supreme Court story, sometimes it's the end of the story that you hear, but it's not the end of the story. Congress responded by passing the Civil Rights Restoration Act, designed specifically to overturn the court's program-specific limitation and make clear that even accepting 1 cent of federal funds would result in relatively complete and comprehensive regulation of the college by the federal government, and that all federal funds received by an educational institution were subject to cutoff if any unit was found to be in violation. After extensive debate, both the House and Senate passed that act in 1987. But President Reagan vetoed it. President Reagan vetoed it, warning that it would, quote, diminish substantially the freedom and independence of universities, what he labeled as, quote, a big government power grab cloaked in the mantle of civil rights. But the Democrats in Congress overrode that veto, transforming the federal funding relationship with higher education. And the practical consequence of that decision was enormous. Once institution-wide coverage became the rule, the threat was no longer confined to a single office or department. An alleged violation, defined and pursued under sort of however the administration is interpreting Title IX, could endanger federal support across the university. And because modern universities are deeply enmeshed with federal dollars, through student aid and research funding in a plethora of different dimensions, many receive the majority of their budget, upward of 75% of their budget, in the form of federal funding. So that leverage that the threat of that has is a very real and existential threat. So that bill I described, it was informally known as the Grove City Bill because its central purpose was clear. It was to overturn the program-specific limitation that the Supreme Court had recognized. Under the Grove City Bill, if a college accepted any federal financial assistance, then federal non-discrimination rules would apply across the institution's operations. And with that, new rules of the game had been set. Federal money would no longer come with program-level strings, it would come with institution-wide strings. And in that moment, Grove City College faced a clear and consequential choice. From that point forward, Grove City's legally careful middle ground, as proposed by the Reagan administration, limit federal reach to the particular program implicated, that path was no longer available. The college would either accept federal dollars and the ecosystem and broad compliance regime that came along with it, or it would have to withdraw from these federal programs entirely and ask families, alumni, and private donors to subsidize what Washington had been subsidizing. President McKenzie faced one of the most consequential choices in the history of this college: accept federal funds and the regulatory authority that came with it, or preserve Grove City College's independence. And he and the college chose independence. That decision was not merely symbolic. It was costly, it required sacrifice, but it preserved something essential: the freedom to operate according to our faith and our mission and our conscience. So what relevance, what lesson does that story have for today? Well, unless you've been living under a rock, you've surely seen the current administration is once again trying to use federal funding and the strings that come with it to exert influence on institutions of higher learning through Title IX. Today it's Harvard rather than Grove City, and the shoe may be on the other foot, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. As I wrote in World Magazine about my two alma maters, Harvard and Grove City College are very different schools. Grove City is a small, conservative Christian college. Harvard is a large, progressive, secular university, but soon they might have something significant in common. To preserve its independence, Grove City has long rejected all federal financial assistance. Now Harvard may be forced to do the same. As a Harvard Law alum, I, like all Harvard alums, received a letter from Harvard's president, Alan Garber, explaining Harvard's predicament. This is what he wrote. He said, quote, "No government, regardless of which party is in power, should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue." Right on, President Garber. In fact, it reminded me of something that John Moore, who was Grove City's president when I was a student, used to say. He famously would say, quote, "As a private Christian college, we have a legitimate concern about federal interference in what we teach and how we teach it." But what Harvard and some of these other Ivy League institutions are finding out is that independence comes at a price. For Grove City, it meant a decade of litigation, and after the Supreme Court decision, it meant choosing faith and freedom over federal funds, so being and operating without the benefit of federal taxpayer dollars. Foregoing that federal largesse, impose financial discipline, and force the college to control costs, find alternative sources of funding, and avoid the administrative bloat that plagues so many colleges today. It was the hardest, but it was also the best decision that was ever made in the history of this college. Now, if you were to listen to the Jeremiad from many in the higher education community, you might think that attaching federal strings to educational dollars, attaching strings to federal educational dollars, you might think that that's some kind of a new idea, something that the current administration just dreamed up. But it's not. It's what happened in the Grove City case. And it's what happened when the Obama administration threatened the loss of federal funding if schools didn't limit process for those accused of sexual harassment on campus. And the loss of federal funding was the implicit threat that gave teeth to the Obama administration's guidance interpreting Title IX to require that schools let transgender students use bathrooms and locker rooms and compete on college sports teams in ways that correspond to the student's self-identified gender identity rather than the sex assigned by biology at birth. So this is not a new issue. But what is new is that until now, it's been easy for a school like Harvard to accept federal funds because there hasn't been much daylight between Harvard's priorities and those of the federal government. And just to be clear, I think Harvard's community should be free to pursue the goals that it deems to be most worthy. Just like Grove City College should have the freedom to pursue its distinctly Christian and conservative vision of higher education. But after the events I described, after that act of Congress, neither of them can expect the government to foot the bill. I, for one, would love to see a ceasefire in the arms race that would lessen the imposing power of the federal government on private educational institutions. But there is a deep irony here, as legal scholar John McGinnis has pointed out. And that is this, that the left bears direct responsibility for establishing the legal mechanism, some might say the legal weapons, that have now been turned against the universities it controls. As McGinnis put it, progressive confidence that state power would reliably serve their ends overlooked the reality that government authority, once unleashed, recognizes no ideological master. When a school accepts money from the federal government, it subjects itself to hundreds of pages of regulations and whatever conditions the government might impose down the road. Few schools would accept a gift on those terms if the donor's name were John Smith instead of Uncle Sam. Federal money comes with strings. Those strings compromise the school's independence and threaten its mission. And independence is not an abstraction. It is a practical precondition that makes everything possible. The ability to govern ourselves, hire for our mission, teach without compulsion, form students in faith and freedom. It allows us to remain faithful to our commitment to being a conservative institution, one that conserves those things we care deeply about and the values that have animated this country for generations. And when I say conservative, I mean those long-standing commitments that have long shaped Grove City College graduates: orthodox Christian belief, free markets and limited government, objective truth, ordered liberty, rooted in faith and freedom, conserving the great ideas, in the parlance of our vision statement, the permanent ideas and traditions of Western civilization. We want to conserve those things that we love the most, this college and what we believe is best about this country and this world. We believe some ideas are better than others, and we teach them. And we believe that some things are good and true and beautiful, and we point our students to them. And conserving and sustaining those things requires that we form students with the moral courage and intellectual seriousness and wisdom to preserve the preconditions of flourishing life in a free society, just like Madison and Adams foretold. Our independence has come at a cost. Grove City College had to fight for its independence to the Supreme Court, and when the dust settled, this college chose faith and freedom over federal funding. We stand for truth, we stand for faith, and we stand for freedom, even when that stand is costly. We want to do that as a college, and we hope that will inspire our graduates to do the same in their own lives. And our nation's independence came the same way. The signers of the Declaration pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and many paid dearly for that freedom they proclaimed. Their courage inspires us because it reminds us that the blessings of liberty are always purchased and always worth defending. So as I start to close, and as we celebrate 250 years of American independence and 150 years of Grove City College, I'm led back to where I began, with one of the great voices in our college's story, J. Howard Pugh, who believed Grove City College should encourage and inculcate into the minds and hearts of students an abiding faith in God and country, a love for freedom, a respect for truth, an acceptance of personal responsibility, and a desire to contribute to the betterment of the human race. Mr. Pugh understood why that kind of formation matters, because the most enduring work that we do isn't what we build with our hands, it's what God builds in people. Listen to his words, inspired by Daniel Webster. If we work on marble, it will perish. If we work on brass, time will efface it. If we rear temples, they will crumble to dust. But if we work upon men's immortal minds, if we imbue them with high principles, with just fear of God and love of their fellow man, we can engrave on these tablets something which no time can efface, and which will brighten and brighten into all eternity. Mr. Pugh understood how vital a college like Grove City College was in his time. But I doubt even he could have imagined how much it would be needed in America today, how urgently our nation needs men and women ready to think clearly and live faithfully and serve joyfully in a changing world. These twin milestones that we celebrate this year, they belong together, because the same convictions that have sustained our nation for 250 years have animated our college for 150. Faith in God, love of freedom, respect for truth, a desire to serve something greater than ourselves. For me, these twin milestones call to mind President Ronald Reagan's sense of morning in America. And from where I stand, it's morning at Grove City College too. So thank you, and may God bless America as our nation celebrates 250 years of independence. May God bless Grove City College as we celebrate 150 years of faith and freedom, and may God bless each of you. Thank you for having me at the conference today. All right, I think maybe we have 10 minutes for questions before folks have to get to lunch. But Roan, do you have a microphone? You want to, if there are any questions, we can talk about them.
Thank you very much, President Lingo. You've given an excellent apologetic for why Grove City. I think everybody here knows the why. But will the talk that you've just given, will it go out to others in the country so that they might also know and appreciate and desire to come to Grove City?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess I'll answer it in two ways. One, maybe you can tell, I put a little bit more time into this one than just getting up and winging something based on, I was a constitutional law professor for a long time, so I love to do this kind of thing, but I can also do it without a lot of prep. But I spent a lot of time thinking about this and Grove City College and our anniversary, in part because I wanted to create something that we could use a few times over and over again. And you may know that we have just finished conducting a national search for a new chief marketing officer for the college. And I saw something when I first started. College Raptor ranked Grove City College as the #1 hidden gem college in the state of Pennsylvania and one of the top 10 hidden gems in the country. And I completely agree. Grove City College is a gem. It is a gem, but it's also way too hidden. That there are thousands of families, if not tens of thousands of families and donors and parents and prospective students who would love to support, attend, be involved in Grove City College if they just knew a little bit more about our history and what we stand for and the values that animate us and what makes us, frankly, really distinctive in American higher education today. So as much as I love to see us as a hidden gem, I hope that we're going to see that change and we're going to drop off that list sometime in the next 4 or 5 years, and we'll just be a gem.
Thank you, President Lingo. You mentioned that faith depends upon freedom. Freedom depends upon faith. It seemed like you kind of made a circle there, that each depends upon the other. However, the quotation from, I think it was John Adams, but this could have come from many of the founding fathers, something along the lines of the Constitution or our government is only for a moral and religious people. Is that relationship between faith and freedom, is it reciprocal, like each supporting the other? Yes, I think they would say that, but would they say it's identical? Each one supports the other to the same extent? I was kind of curious because I can definitely see the argument of faith supports freedom. That's definitely there. But then freedom supports faith. Mm-hmm. If that were strictly true, shouldn't we have just kept cycling upward? A little bit more freedom gave us more faith, and then more faith gave us more freedom, and more. Wouldn't it have just kept going and going?
Well, yeah, good question. So two responses. If you want to see an example of where they try to promote faith without freedom, look at, for example, the coronation of the recent that happened in England. Did anyone watch that coronation? The royal coronation a couple years ago? If you watched it, it was from start to finish a religious ceremony. From start to finish a religious ceremony. If you look at what's happened in Europe, Europe still has state religion. If you look at what happened, Russia, listen to Vladimir Putin talk about Orthodox Christianity. You'd think you were about to experience one of the most religious places on the planet. But what history has shown is that central government planners, and actually when the state takes over religion, you're not getting into a virtuous circle, you're going into a downward spiral. And if you want a great illustration of that, watch the royal coronation from a couple of years ago, and then think about what's happened in the experiment that's probably most similar to ours, England over Great Britain over, say, the last 250 years. And I think you'd have the answer. And then the second piece of that, you were asking about that quote from John Adams in the letter to the Massachusetts militia. We said our nation was made only for religious and moral people. Some people, that quote is actually a lot more popular than when I first started writing about it years ago. And so some people take that as some kind of a call to a state religion, or what, I don't like to use this term, but what some people might call Christian nationalism. But that's not what he was saying. That's why I added that other quote. It says, without that, it will tear through, the people will tear through the safeguards of the Constitution in the way that a whale would tear through a net. And why he's saying the Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people is because the Constitution embeds freedom and liberty into the very structure of our government. And if we didn't have a religious people and religion as a mechanism to promote civic virtue and love of fellow man, then you would need, as Madison warned, the chains of despotism instead of a constitution of liberty. Maybe time for one or two more. Yeah, Joe?
Thank you, President Lingo. Joe Licani. I'm a C.S. Lewis scholar here at Grove City, and thank you for your wonderful talk. I've taught at different institutions as well, over at the King's College in New York, Pepperdine. My question is, what you guys have achieved here, it seems to me, in 150 years, you've held on to your deep Christian convictions. The gospel is central, and you've maintained these high academic standards, academic excellence. There's a lot of skepticism out there that Christian colleges can actually do that over the long haul. You're a living model that you can do it. So what do you say to people, the watching world, about how you hold on to these two great distinctives over the long haul? How has Grove City been able to do it?
Oh, I don't see any tension between those at all, right? Like we work, not for our own glory, but for the glory of God. We labor not for ourselves alone, but for something much higher. And when you think about academic excellence, and you think about the purpose of Grove City College, so in higher education today, so many people are going to say the purpose of higher education is to get skills to get a job. That's what we're doing here. When you're a Christian college, you have a completely different vision. What we say, we are forming students to live out their calling, their God-given calling, God's call on their life for the remainder of their life. And if you think about what's happening that way, that leads you to take the 4 years that we have with them very, very seriously. It means the stakes are much higher than just preparing someone with the tools and skills that they're going to need to put food on the table. But we have 4 years together to prepare them as people and as laborers to live out God's call on their life. And so that means that we absolutely intend to make the most of every minute of those 4 years with our students, because what we think we're doing is so much more important than it's thought at many other secular institutions. Yeah, thanks, Joe. All right, last question. Anyone have one more?
This is a yes, no question. Sorry, real quick.
Okay.
Did Benjamin Rush start the public school system?
We have an expert on Benjamin Rush right here, so.
Joe, sorry, but for the purpose of teaching the Bible?
Well, he didn't start it, but he wanted the Bible as central, as part of that whole educational process. Thought it was absolutely essential to have the scriptures, and particularly in terms of moral education, educating young people for virtue, as the president said. Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right.
Thank you so much. In light of our postmodern world that is, and what's being taught at so many of the secular universities, I think Grove City has a call to be distinctively Christian. And I sometimes feel like, and I had, 2 children who went here, and I would hear that a lot from other parents as well. This idea of faith and freedom, I mean, we all can uphold that and embrace that. But how does that play out in terms of today being distinctively Christian in this world that we live in, and especially compared to other universities?
Well, it means that it means that our Christian faith should animate everything that we do. And to go back to piggyback on this in terms of what are we doing, right? What we really want to be is like the best 4-year discipleship program on the planet. That whether you're studying political science or education or math, that's just a tool that we're using with an ultimate goal, yes, preparing students for their calling, but also to see that they're formed more like Jesus in the 4 years that they spend here, wherever they're starting. And they're starting in very different places sometimes, but wherever they're starting, that they've been formed to be more like Jesus by the time that they're 4 years removed. And so that means really guarding our faculty hiring, to hire not just world-class scholars and good teachers, but people who really want to be here to be engaged in ministry. It means cultivating a bespoke community of students that are going to encourage each other and exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. It means, frankly, as a leader, whether that be me or anybody else in leadership of the college, modeling the fruit of the Spirit in the way that we live and learn and lead and in our own lives with love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and self-control. So those are big aspirations, and like any college, we don't always live up to all of our highest aspirations, but those are our aspirations inspired by our faith.
Thank you, Dr. Lingo.
Yeah. Well, you just gave me a promotion. I'm just a lowly lawyer, but thank you, and I look forward to seeing many of you at lunch, and I'll also be back at dinner, so I look forward to seeing you, many of you there. Thank you.